This is page 1 of a new section, and our section title is Fault Tolerance. So everything's not always going to work perfectly, and how can you design to handle those situations? So first we're going to talk about some terminology. And the text reference here is 13.1. Let me put these terms in green. So there are three terms generally when you're talking about fault tolerance. There's the fault, there's the error that manifests because of the fault, and then failure that can happen as a result of that error. So the fault is an abnormal condition or defect. I should admit that the definitions for fault, error, and failure are not agreed upon. Out there you'll find faults and errors mixed up, errors and failures mixed up, but what I'm showing you is pretty commonly accepted. So an abnormal condition could be something like a lightning strike. So something in the environment that maybe you weren't planning on. This happened at the launch of the Apollo 12 mission. So there was some low clouds, but not enough to generate lightning, but apparently the ionized exhaust from the rocket created the conditions for lightning, and it created havoc. Okay, another example might be a design flaw. So it's an error baked right into the product that's been created. And lastly, it could be metal fatigue. Okay, so those are faults. Next we have the error. An error is a deviation of actual state from the correct state of things. So examples of these could be a voltage overload on the power bus. And when this happened in the Apollo 12, it took the fuel cells offline. They were protected. Took the navigation offline. Took pretty much everything. I think they still had communications with control. An example of a design flaw would be there's a suspension bridge in the Tacoma Narrows. The design of it was such that wind of a certain speed, a high speed, would cause it to start undulating, and there's videos out there of this thing undulating, and even somebody driving a car across it while it's undulating. So an undulating suspension bridge. And in the case of metal fatigue, what I was thinking of is jets have these fans that compress the air before it goes into the engine, and so you can end up with a broken fan blade, and you don't want loose pieces of metal flying around inside a jet engine. So then the failure would be a deviation from expected behavior or service, depends what you're talking about. So For example, the Apollo 12 systems were all offline about a minute after launch. In the case of the undulating bridge, which I didn't say it was called Galloping Gertie informally, it ended up collapsing. And there are cases where a fan blade has had metal fatigue, it wasn't detected, and in flight the blade broke off and caused the engine to blow up. So jet engine explodes. So there's two main approaches to dealing with faults. First approach is avoidance. So prevent the fault from happening. And examples of that could be improved launch protocols. So they studied how rockets could generate or create lightning strikes, and so part of the launch protocols now are closer collaboration with meteorologists to make sure that there aren't the right conditions for a rocket to generate a lightning strike. In the case of the bridge collapse, they didn't have this available when Galloping Gertie was built, but wind tunnel testing could have revealed this problem before the bridge was built, and millions were wasted. Nobody died with that one. And in the case of fan blades and jet engines, in case I've made you nervous, part of regular maintenance is X-raying the fan blades to look for these tiny little stress fractures in the blades. So okay, so that's one approach. And another approach is some things are going to happen. There's not a lot you can do about it, but you can try to let it not result in a failure. You might continue to operate within spec or specification. So what happened with the Apollo 12 is there's this guy named John Aaron who's part of the flight control, and something in the output twigged something, and he realized that these power buses were offline, and so he said, flight, try SEC to AUX. So I'll just write that down and I'll explain. Well, so first let me write this. Redundant components. So if you Google try signal conditioning equipment SEC to AUX or auxiliary, this flight controller, John Aaron, figured out what was going on and said to switch the signal conditioning equipment to, I guess, auxiliary power. I think that's what that meant. And it solved their problem, and they were able to, they didn't have to abort the launch, and it was a successful mission. Another option is graceful degradation of service. And let me just go back up to failure here. Beside failure, I want to put service. Okay, so example of graceful degradation of service might be something like, well, here's a completely different example. Thermal throttling of a processor. So if an integrated circuit gets too hot, errors can be introduced, erroneous values, and so on. And so processors have, I guess, thermostats built into them that can be read and can be, if the processor is getting too hot, they can slow the clock speed down so that it doesn't get to the point where it's going to start operating out of spec and producing bad results. So another form of tolerance is the failsafe, where you halt in a safe manner. So examples of those include things called deadman switches. They should really be called dead person switches now. In trains, there would be some kind of device that the operator would have to keep pressure applied to. If the operator had a heart attack or passed out or was somehow incapacitated, the train would lose power and slow down instead of continuing to throttle under full power with an incapacitated operator. Another example of that is riding mowers. They have a switch, an electrical switch under the seat, and if you're not sitting on the seat applying pressure on that switch, then either the blades will cut out or the whole engine will shut down.